Good evening and welcome to the American Farriers Journal online hoof care classroom, measuring the hoof in radiographs and photographs. I'm Jeff Cota, lead content editor of American Farriers Journal. Tonight's presenter is John Craig, founder and vice president of EponaMind. John has researched the hoof and shoeing systems for the past 20 years. He has authored papers related to equine biomechanics and has spoken extensively on biomechanics and the connection between machines and biomechanics of animals. Before John gets started with the presentation, I have a couple of housekeeping items to take care of. On your screen, there is a control panel with a Q&A icon. You can submit questions here at any time during the presentation. Time permitting, we will look to answer as many questions as possible following the presentation. If for any reason your internet connection or even our connection should happen to fail at some point, and it looks like the webinar has been interrupted, just go back to the email that you received earlier telling you how to join the webinar, and you can re-enter the webinar that way. Okay, let's get started. Thanks for joining us today, and take it away, John.
Okay, Jeff, thank you very much. So my name is John Craig, and I'll be talking about measuring the hoof. This work is joint with my wife, who is the farrier in the family. I'm her engineer slave that helps her on things she dreams up. The talk is kind of in two parts. The first part is like going back to school and maybe a little bit boring, but learning and talking a little bit about how to make measurements in radiographs and photographs. And then the second half of the talk will be about something called deep learning you may or may not have heard about. This is a type of artificial intelligence that is hitting the news lately and coming into our world, and we're starting to leverage it here to automate the measuring of horses' feet. So we'll talk about that. So let's just dive in here. I've got a lot of material, so I'm just going to go through this, and hopefully there'll be some time for questions at the end. So the first most simple thing to know about radiography is that the X-ray generator that is creating the X-rays creates them from a point source, essentially a point source. And they come out the front of the generator and they spread. Like these red lines show how they spread and just touch the edges of this bone that we're taking an X-ray of. So if you just remember this, it'll be clear to you why people say there is magnification in X-rays. This bone, the way it would project onto that X-ray detector, it would look this big. And so there is magnification inherent in X-rays because of this very simple geometry. A concept that I want to just get the word out there about is called the central beam. Central beam is the direction the generator is pointing. And everything that we're going to talk about, we keep things simple. This beam is pointing perpendicular to the detector panel, and then the other photons are spreading out from that. So that's just the definition. We'll see that again later in the talk. And the same idea of the spreading X-ray beam is why if you take a radiograph of a horse's foot, you need to put it on a block. If you see the red lines I've drawn here, the lower red line is just grazing the bottom of the foot, and that will image on the detector plate at a lower place below the surface of the block. And for that simple reason, you need to put the foot on a block. If you just stand the horse on a concrete floor and take an X-ray, you're not going to get to the very bottom of the foot. Also, these detector panels or film cassettes are not sensitive all the way out to their outer edge. There's usually a 1/4 inch or more of dead space. So for a couple of reasons, you need to put the foot on a block. And here I've added the central beam. And I think most veterinarians are taught in vet school that you aim the central beam about at the height of the navicular bone. So that is, you use a block, which is the right height given your generator to get this accomplished. But we'll talk about that later, about where the central beam should be aimed. Now, going back to our little simple world here, we want to introduce the concept of the so-called plane of interest. Anytime we want to measure something in a 2D image, that 2D image is a projection of the 3D world, it really would clarify our thinking to have this notion of plane of interest in mind. So here I've drawn sort of a center line for this bone, and it's in that plane, and that plane is parallel to the plane of the X-ray detector and perpendicular to the central beam. It's in this plane of interest that we'll make measurements, okay? So that could be at the leading edge of the bone or the back part of the bone. Here I've shown it in the center of the bone. It's depending what you're trying to accomplish, where you imagine that your plane of interest is. So that's sort of a definition that we'll use. And with that in mind, then one can measure with a ruler these two distances. One is called OFD, stands for object film distance. That's from the plane of interest to the detector or the film. And the other one is FFD. That's from the point source of the X-ray to the film or detector. And if you measure those two things, you can figure out what the magnification is going to be. It's this formula I'm showing at the bottom. And so that's one way to do things, but it's kind of a pain to try and measure things when you're out working around a horse. So we don't really want to do it that way. So let's go further. The next point I want to make here, these little vertical purple stripes in the plane of interest, let's pretend they're little metallic nails. I've got 3 of them here in the field of view, and they're all projecting onto the film or X-ray, and you see they're becoming enlarged. There's magnification going on. And we could compute that magnification factor by that formula I had shown. But the point I want to make here is that the magnification factor is the same for all 3 of these objects. It's a sometimes misunderstood fact. It is not the case that there's more magnification at the outer edges of the image, or there's less at the central beam. Magnification is uniform over the entire image if we're talking about things that are infinitesimally thin in a certain plane of interest. Okay, so that's one message to remember. And because of that, a nice thing to do is to place a scale marker in the plane of interest. Here, the little black object is meant to be, again, something metallic, a nail. It's of known size, and we place it in the plane of interest where we want to make measurements, and then you see it projects onto the film, and it gets magnified. But if it's an inch long in real life, then what's imaged on the plate we know is then an inch, and that gives us a scale marker, and we can make sense of any measurement in the image. And so this is a nice way to do things, and it's much easier than having to measure those 2 distances with a ruler and write them down. You just put a scale marker in the plane of interest when you take the X-ray. And so it's very convenient to put that scale marker in the block, because we've already said we basically absolutely must stand the hoof on a block to take a good radiograph. So why not build that scale marker into the block? And what we do is we put it right at the center line of the block. So your job is to stand the horse with its hoof centered on the center line of the block. And that sets the plane of interest. The plane of interest is this green vertical line that I've drawn. And any measurement we want to make will be accurate in that plane. So your job is to stand the horse on the block. That's the hardest part of this whole deal. And we like to stand the center line of the hoof along the long fiducial of the block. And usually we put the widest part of the foot at the secondary fiducial of the block. And with the horse stood on the block, we can take a lateral X-ray and we can take a frontal or DP X-ray without moving the horse. And there are scale markers in both directions within the block. I'll just mention that you could alternatively, you could use a scale marker. So this plastic thing has some metal inside of it, which will image in a radiograph. And you can avoid an expensive fancy block. You can stand the hoof on a chunk of wood here, but put a scale marker at the center line of the toe, and that will work. So we have this as an option too. Myself, around a horse, I don't want one more thing to handle. So this little scale marker goes flying. You've got to handle the block anyway. So I like the scale marker just built into the block. Now, unfortunately, there's one complication with X-rays. We usually are not radiographing things that are infinitesimally thin. We're radiographing subjects which have some thickness. And so here, if we took this sort of bed of nails and shot an X-ray at it, and the X-ray would look like this, as you might have imagined. So the nail that is close to the central beam images sort of as a dot, and as we go away from that, the other ones image as longer and longer line segments. This is really because if you think you could think of it as being 2 planes of interest. One plane is the base of the metal, and the other plane is at the top of the metal. Those 2 planes have a different geometric offset from the detector, and so they have 2 different magnification factors. So the magnification is uniform at the base of the metal spikes, and it's uniform at the top of the metal spikes, but it's 2 different factors. And so you get this sort of distortion. So one way to summarize radiography is to say that a radiographic image is a combination of these 2 effects. One effect is that there's uniform magnification for any given plane of interest where you might want to measure. But secondly, there is a distortion for any thick objects, which is minimized near the central beam. And that's why sometimes it does come up that where you point the central beam is important. That's where you're going to get the best image without this sort of smearing distortion that I just explained. So, and then as sort of an aside, there's a lot of other things that go on in radiography, taking an image. And there's, as you're aware, there's image processing. We enhance contrast and edges. And there's factors that make the image look better or not as good. There's something called heel effect, which is a generator issue, backscattered radiation, calibration issues, lots of other things. Many of these things do not actually affect calibration, or if they affect it, they only affect it in very slight ways. So really what does affect calibration is just the geometry of the arrangement, which I showed in the last few slides. Now, the state of the art in calibration of radiography. There are a lot of people getting modern digital radiography systems, or CR stands for computer radiography systems. Sometimes they are not easy to take a picture and measure things. So for one thing, some systems out in the world will show a reticle like this on the image. They'll show this sort of set of tick marks on the image, which will give you the illusion that you might be able to measure something in this image. But unless you measured those two distances, OFD and FFD, and typed them in to this X-ray system, or unless there was a scale marker placed at the plane of interest, then the software in this radiograph system cannot possibly know what the scale factor in effect was. So some of these systems show these scales like this, but it's absolutely approximate and you can't count on it. So you have to keep that in mind. And some other systems will actually go so far to put these words right in the image, like sizes are approximate, warning you not to trust the measurements you get on this system. So this is all, I think this is all going to change now. I mean, it's kind of crazy the amount of money spent on radiography systems, and they don't make it easy to take a measurement, right? So I think hoof radiography done right is something like this. A hoof block with an integrated metal scale marker makes a lot of sense. Nothing else to handle when you're handling the horse. You stand the horse on the block properly, both feet on blocks at the same time, ideally. And ideally all 4 feet on blocks, although it's hard to put the hind feet of horses on blocks, so very often we skip that. I think that's kind of okay over the size of a horse, but ideally the back feet would be the same height. The digital radiography system should automatically find that scale marker and apply it to any measurements you make automatically. That would be nice. It's okay if you have to click a couple points to make that happen, but ideally do it automatically. And then a point here at the bottom, which I'll say more about later. If you get a better image for measuring if you move the generator further away from the hoof. A lot of people are taught to place the generator about 26 inches from the hoof. If you move it back to say 36 inches, you'll get a better image for measurement. And you'll have to set the technique on the generator a bit higher and collimate it down, but the patient gets the same dose of radiation, so it's not putting more radiation on the patient. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. So let's just go through kind of an example here, see how this all works. So here I took one of these nice freeze-dried legs from Ali Hayes, and I put 2 little tiny metal BBs in it, one at the tip of P3 and one at approximately the center of articulation of the coffin joint. If you imagine a circle fit through the articular surface, then the center of that circle is the articulation center. So I put these 2 BBs in, and now I measure them with a good old ruler, and I can see that they're about 3 1/8 inches apart, or 3.125 in decimal. Okay, so that's the correct answer. Now we want to measure that in a radiograph and get that answer. And here we've done it. We've taken an X-ray of that freeze-dried hoof on a block. The block at the base of this image, you see the metal in the block. Those 2 balls are the ones that are picked up to do the scale marker. And you see the distance between those 2 BBs is 3.12. That's the right answer. So that's great. As long as you stand the hoof properly on the block, you'll get an accurate measurement. And here I've put one block, the red cross in the image shows where the X-ray beam center is located. And on the right, I put 2 blocks under the foot, but I left the generator the same height. So it's shooting way under the foot in that case. But you see the measurement of those 2 points come out exactly the same. The image on the right, if you look at some details of the hoof, there are some things that are showing some distortion because we're getting away from the central beam. But as long as you're talking about measurements between points in the plane of interest, the magnification is uniform in the entire plane, so it doesn't matter where the beam center is located to make this measurement. So I'm just demonstrating that here. And here are 4 different images taken with 4 different setups where I used a ruler and I wrote down what the FFD and the OFD were, and from them computed the magnification based on that formula. And you see, in fact, between the lower 2 images, the one on the left looks smaller and the one on the right looks physically bigger because it had 69% magnification. But the measurement that I make in the software between the 2 points of interest is always coming out exactly the same. So if you're using this system with the scale marker and the block, you can measure, doesn't matter where you plunk the generator down. You don't have to carefully measure where it was because you've got the scale marker in the right place. You don't have to measure OFD and FFD. So it's very nice. That's the way to do it. And then this one thing to talk about, I'm going to call it the depth of field of accuracy. You know, depth of field is a term used for focus in photography. The more light you have, the bigger depth of field you get. It's kind of like that for measuring and with pulling the generator further and further away from the foot. The bigger you make the FFD, or actually the smaller you make the OFD, you minimize the magnification coefficient. And that means over neighboring planes of interest, you get closer to the same value, and that reduces that distortion. So this is kind of an advanced concept, but if you follow that, I mean, the bottom line is it's good to not have the generator so close to the hoof if you want to take an image for measurement. And here's a little demonstration we did. This is the freeze-dried leg, actually. And the red cross on the image shows where the X-ray was taken. And I'm going to run an animation here, which is, and I hope the internet connections are holding up and we can see this video. This is showing how the image looks as I change where the generator is pointing. And we're also measuring the palmar angle in this case. And what I want to show is that in this case, the palmar angle is staying pretty constant, no matter where we're placing the generator. So this is effectively, I was changing the height of the block. And I took a sequence of, I think, 24 different radiographs. But what I did is I set the generator at 36 inches away from the hoof, not at 26. And I would have liked to have had time to make the same animation at 26 inches to really make the point, but I didn't have that time. But what you see here is there is a lot of talk amongst practitioners. Should I be pointing the beam at the top of the block, or is it okay to point it at the navicular bone like they taught me in vet school? How does that affect palmar angle? So this is a little demonstration to show that. And the answer is, if you keep the generator back, say at 36 inches, about a meter, you don't have to worry about it too much. You get a pretty good palmar angle reading regardless of where that's exactly pointed. If you're going to move the generator in very close, then you have to think about it more, and it probably is better to have it lower in the image for measuring palmar angle. But just pull it back further, take an image, you can measure lots of things, not just the palmar angle, and they'll all be better for the bigger distance. Okay, now I'm going to switch on to photographing the foot briefly. Here's our block, and the first point to make is that if you take a block and you put a scale on the outer edge of it, and then you measure something that's on the center line of that block, you lose some accuracy. Right here, I'm using the scale marker highlighted in green and red on the outer edge of the block, and what I'm measuring is clearly 5 inches, but my software is telling me it's 4.33. So there's error introduced because my scale marker is not in the same plane of interest as what I'm trying to measure. So our block is got this 4-point scaling system, which I'm not going to go into how it works, but basically, if you pick these 4 points in the block, we then can translate the plane of interest to the center line of the block. And if you measure something that's 5 inches, you'll get the measurement 5 inches in the software. So it's a special block for photographing the hoof that lets you get accurate measurements in the center line of the hoof. And the difference it can make is these two images are exactly the same images. I'm just showing that the top image, we use a scale marker on the outside of the block. The bottom image, we use the 4-point scaling system, which resolves the plane of interest to the center line. And you get, you get 15 or 20% error depending on the setup. Again, if you have the camera further away, you get less of an error and so forth. So, but something to think about. And likewise, another way to do this is to have a scale marker, something of known size that you place right at the toe, right at the center line of the toe, and then you take a photo. This is convenient for hind feet, especially because it's hard to get horses to stand on blocks with the hind feet. But it's not really quite as accurate because the center of the lens of the camera ideally has to be at the bottom of the foot, so it would have to be right down on the floor. And you can't get the center of the lens on the floor. So a block is also really to do photography of the hoof properly. You need to put the foot on a block. Although you can get pretty close, a good approximation, if you get the camera as far to the ground as you can when standing off a block. And the other thing, just like we talked about the generator, moving it further away is better. These two images are the same hoof. Actually, I took them about 13 seconds apart. On the left, I was about a foot away from the hoof. And on the right, I was about 5 or 6 feet away from the hoof, but zoomed in. And if you're further away and you zoom in, it tends to flatten the image. It makes your depth of measurement greater. You see the black dots on the block are nicely centered in the center of the circles, whereas on the left, they're actually, one of them's out of view because you're in the left image, we're suffering sort of perspective bug eye effects. And the hairline looks different. It looks like it goes up higher on the left than on the right. So interestingly, if you measured the toe length down the center line of the toe in either image, it would come out the same because in the plane of interest, we'll get the same measurement. But as you move away from that plane, you get more and more error if the camera was close. So if you're measuring the height of the hairline, it's towards us, it's not on the center line of the block, so you're inducing error. So the bottom line, for a more accurate photo, hold the camera about a meter, about a yard away from the hoof and zoom in. That's better than getting close. It's also safer in case the horse freaks out. So stay away from the horse. And here's the summary bullets. A hoof block with integrated scale marker makes a lot of sense. One less thing to handle around the horse. Stand the horse properly on the block, as always. It really helps in photography to place a blank background board or something behind the hoof so we're not seeing the opposite leg. Makes a nice clean image. And then you need to hold the camera low. The center of the lens should be at the height of the block. So basically the camera is almost sitting on the ground depending on how your block is. And again, just like in radiography, you get a better image for measuring if you increase the distance. So be about 36 inches, be about a yard or about a meter away from the hoof when you take a photo. And finally, for sole pictures, we also have a little scale marker that goes in the finger, and you get that scale marker in the plane of the foot. And then if you take a picture like this, we can later in the software measure the distance of the heels and the width of the foot and so forth. So I'm not going to talk too much about the solar view, but that's something you can also calibrate. That's the end of part one of the talk. Part two of the talk, we really change gears, but we'll come back to measuring in a minute. And this stuff, in the beginning, you might be saying, wait a minute, what's this got to do with horses? But I'm going to give you a little gentle introduction to the stuff called neural networks and deep learning. Okay, you've probably heard the term artificial intelligence, and that's sort of, broadly speaking, any technique that enables computers to kind of act smart, right? Just loosely defined. Within artificial intelligence, one technique is called machine learning. And that's a type of artificial intelligence where you use certain things where the computer learns through experience. You show it more data or you give it more trials, and it sort of learns on its own instead of we having to program it explicitly. And within machine learning, there's something called deep learning. And this has been this big buzz just in the last 5 or 6 years. But it's a way to do machine learning where you show the computer lots of data. In our case, we're going to show it tens of thousands of radiographs and photographs of horses' feet, and the computer is going to learn about horses' feet. So it's kind of interesting stuff. We don't have to go into details here, but the neural network is each of these circles in this image you can think of as a neuron in a brain, and neurons are interconnected, and they're sort of layers going left from right. So you put an input in the left and something comes out the output in the right. And when they use the term deep learning, the word deep means that there's many, many layers. This one I'm showing you is not a deep network, it's a shallow network. But as I say in the text just under the image, some networks in use today have 150 or more layers of neurons, and so they're called deep networks. And that's what deep learning, that the term comes from that. But this doesn't really matter. It's just the way, it's a particular software algorithm. This is all done in software. And the sort of a main problem that we can solve with deep learning is called image classification. It'd be very cool to be able to show the computer a picture of a cat, a dog, or a car, and the computer figures out and says that that's a cat, that's a dog. And so the input to the neural network, there's one of these circles for every pixel in the image. And a typical image, as you may have heard, is 5 megapixels or 10 megapixels. So there can be 10 million pixels coming in. So the network I've drawn at the bottom only shows 3. So this thing is much huger than that. But it's possible to make these neural networks recognize things in images. And the way you train them, if you want to train it to know what a cat is, you have to show it thousands or tens of thousands of pictures of cats, because cats come in all different sizes, shapes, colors. You might be photographing some from the back, from the front. A cat could be twisted lying on its back. So you have to show the computer tens of thousands or possibly hundreds of thousands of examples of cats. And you show it likewise all these pictures of dogs. And you have to label each one properly. So you have to say, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a dog, because the computer is going to learn whatever you tell it. So we give it a bunch of data and we give it the correct answer for each image. And once we've trained a neural network, then we can show it a picture that it never saw before of a cat, and the computer will say it's a cat. So that's like cool. But just like a human, the algorithm can sometimes make a mistake. So what's been going on in the computer science world is they would have a yearly competition to see, to put 1,000 images in front of this computer and see if it could get them right or not. And I'll show you a chart here for the winners of that competition from 2010 through 2015. And the bar charts here are showing the amount of errors made. So the first one for 2010, 0.28, means that 28% of the time it made a mistake. It thought a cat was a dog or whatever. And then in 2011 is 25%. Something happened in 2012. Suddenly the guy showed up. It was a team from Canada, and his algorithm did it with only 15% error. So, and that's when they sort of invented, let's say, or leveraged deep learning. And then since then, everyone got on the bandwagon. And now the only way to compete in this competition is to use deep learning. And you'll see that it came down. And in 2015, it got down to 3.6% error. And they kind of use 5% error as a rule of thumb for what a human does. In fact, they had a graduate student at Stanford look through, I don't know how many, at least 10,000 images, and he made about 5% errors. So you can say in 2015, the computer became superhuman. It can recognize things in images better than a human. And in this competition, they're not just using cats, dogs, and refrigerator and cars. They're, as I say at the bottom, they had 1,000 image classes. So there were cats, dogs, cars, refrigerators, pictures of mountains, trees, other things, 1,000 different things that it had to be able to tell. So it's pretty exciting, and that's why maybe you've heard things in the news. Here's another chart showing the same thing. Basically, the computers came down and it got better and better, and in 2015, they became better than humans in some sense. And we won't go into it. Neural networks were around since the 1970s, but they didn't pop up and suddenly become practical till 2012. So there's a whole story behind that. I won't go into this. And if you look now at the papers being published in this field in the last few years since 2012, it's like skyrocketing. This is actually done by country. So China is doing the most in the field, and the United States close behind, and so forth. A lot of interest. This is funding by venture capitalists. pumping money into new companies that are trying to do deep learning based things. So it's going up. This is $5 billion in 2016. This is a chart. The details don't matter, but there's 106 companies here, all in the human health field, which are all trying to do deep learning. And many are most funded by venture capitalists, and most springing up since 2012. So there's this crazy revolution going on. And things like this you may see in the newspaper, these little stories, and these are just from the last year, that, you know, at some university, they got AI to look at chest x-rays, and it's diagnosing pneumonia better than expert radiologists. So some of these things you have to take with a grain of salt. In fact, I would say take a lot of these things with a grain of salt, because these are university studies. Radiologists are not going to be replaced yet, but these systems are going to become assistants to radiologists, and it's going to make their job easier. So we have taken those ideas. Now we'll get back to the horse. We've taken those ideas, and instead of looking for cats, dogs, and cars and images, we're going to look for lateral hocks and lateral necks and 60-degree DP shots of the foot. So we want to teach the computer how to recognize all the different radiographic views of the horse. And so there's a bunch of them, as you guys know. And so just to throw some numbers out, these are already old numbers. We've gotten bigger now, but we have about 85,000 images. We use 24,000 for training the computer. There's something called data augmentation that we multiply by 10. Anyway, so about 250,000 images. We have taught the computer 48 different views of the horse, which pretty much covers the horse. We're going to increase that a little bit more. We also build in a four-fold rotation. So it'll not only say that's a left lateral hock, it'll also say things like that's a left lateral hock rotated minus 90 degrees. So however the vet held the plate when he took the shot, that we'll figure that out too. And after we've done it and we feed it a set of 5,000 test images, we get about a 4% error rate. And I think it is at human expert level or above, because I'll show you a little bit where those 4% errors occur. They occur in places where a human expert might make a mistake. Like these two images on the left, there's a DP shot of a foot. A good vet or a good farrier with a lot of experience can tell that that's a left or a right. But it's a little bit tricky. A lot of people can't tell, is that a left or a right? Our neural network using deep learning will get it right like all the time, almost all the time, because it has learned the difference between a left and a right. The image on the right is a so-called navicular skyline shot. That is very hard, very, very hard for even a human expert to know if it's a left or a right foot. And so most of the 4% errors the neural network is making are shots like that on the right-hand side, where it's quite hard. Now the navicular bone actually is a little bit non-symmetric. It's a little bit longer to the lateral side. And so the neural network can try and learn that and look for that, but it's very subtle. And depending on how you image the shot, it may not be apparent. So some mistakes come in, but they're like a human expert would make. This is a listing of the 48 views that we've taught the system for radiography, but not important for you guys to look at that really. And here, let me show you a first little demo. I'm running a video. I hope you can see it. And these are very small thumbnail images. They're randomly oriented and they're not labeled. And the red box is going through. This is how fast it operates. It's identifying what the radiograph is, rotating it if necessary, and putting a label on it. So it goes about half a second per image. And there's 40 images here, and it's getting these all right, by the way. But as I say, it will make about 4% error. So that's, you know, kind of cool. Here's another example, the same thing, but in this case, we're like submitting to Keeneland or something. We know we want 14 images. We know we want them in a certain order. So it's going to go through and label them all, and then it's going to interact with the user a little bit, saying, hey, there's some images that don't fit in. There's more than one of these 60-degree DP shots. I think this one should be a left. And the user can say, yeah, that one's actually a left, and can relabel. And then the system says, hey, there's one extra one which is not needed in the sequence that we're after, so let's delete it. So we say, okay, we'll delete it. And once we've done that, then it puts them in the correct order. Now you're ready to submit them to the sales organization or whatever. So it's a very practical thing for a veterinarian to have this sort of assistant helping them. So as I mentioned, sales outfits like Keeneland sell thousands of horses, and you submit 36 radiographs for each horse, and they need to be properly labeled, put in the right order, and all that stuff. So nice to have an assistant do it for you. And point number 2, I'm going to show you a quick video of the system being used. There is some audio on this. I hope you can hear it. Mostly the beeping of the generator and the voice announcing of the shot. So as soon as you take a shot, we get a preview image in 2 seconds on the screen, and now the neural network's looking at it. And it's going to voice announce.
Left, hop, lateral.
And then it image processes it the proper way for that anatomy. And we're already then at the horse shooting the next shot. So it's really cool. You don't have to tell the computer what you're going to do ahead of time. You just go up to the horse.
Left, front, fetlock, lateral.
Just go up to the horse and start shooting. If you want to make sure you get a certain set of shots, there's a way for the software then to tell you which ones you're missing.
Lateral. Ready.
So in this sense, we're using deep learning to be a ease of workflow for the practitioner.
Left, front, fetlock, lateral to medial, oblique.
And it has learned the weird medial oblique shots and all kinds of things. Now, if we take a hoof shot, which is what we'll talk about mostly from now on, then it firstly identifies it, if it's a left or a right.
Left, front, foot, DP.
That is correct. And now it goes on to measure, and this is what we'll talk about next. So we have automated the measuring of these images, also using deep learning. So that is all happening for you. While you're still out at the horse, working on the horse, it's gone ahead and measured things for you. And it could voice announce the palmar angle or things like that if you wanted. Okay, so just to review the image classification, we have a neural network. It happens to have 58 million tunable parameters, 58 million neurons. Just thought I'd tell you this out of interest. So what we've really done is we've trained it using 250,000 images in order to cleverly adjust 58 million values so it would learn. And the result is that it makes about 4% error. And a note on the bottom, there's about 100 billion neurons in the human brain. So having only 58 million, we're not there yet. Okay, now that's image classification, but now I want to talk about key point localization, which is what we use to make measurements in the image. And this started from people measuring finding points on faces because they want to automatically recognize faces for security applications and different things. So, but we said, hey, we don't care about points on faces. We want to find points on horse anatomy. So the red dots on this DP radiograph, for example, are some key points that we could locate. We could teach the computer how to locate them. So that's what we did. And let me show you a video here. This will go through taking a lateral X-ray and then taking a DP X-ray, and it'll go through the whole process. This is, you'll see it first calibrate by finding the metal in the block. It's indicated that right now. And now it's placing points on the bones and the hoof wall to make the measurements. And if you're familiar with the Metron software, it's been around for 18 years. In the first 17 years, our users had to pick all these points. But now last year we automated it so the computer does it for you. So that's a step forward finally. Here's a DP shot. And again, we'll recognize the block, find the scale marker within the block, and then pick points on the anatomy and generate measurements. Each of these images can generate 10 to 20 measurements, but we're just showing 1 or 2 of interest. You can set up the system to show whatever you want. I'm showing the coffin joint tilt, which is interesting for medial lateral balance. Okay, so here's just a little summary. We find 20 points in the lateral, we find 11 points in the DP, some more for the scale markers, about 0.1% of image dimension accuracy. So we're getting within about 1 or 2 pixels. Takes about half a second per point, but we're going to speed that up. it's probably picking at about human speed right now. Okay, now the next thing I want to do, we're getting a little low on time, is to show, some people have said, well, okay, this Metron is cool, but if you don't position the block just right and position the foot just right, you'll get bad measurements. And so I would just like to say it's not black and white. In fact, there's a slow degradation. This is a video I'm going to run. And what we did here is we essentially had the hoof on a turntable, and we are rotating the block in the hoof plus or minus 15 degrees from perfect alignment. And the neural network is picking the polymer angle each time. So I also did this as a test to see how the neural network is going to consistently pick these points nicely. And so this, and I, as I say, I go plus or minus 15 degrees, and only in the last 5 degrees either direction does the polymer angle accuracy really suffer. On the right-hand side, as a take-home message, I've said, if you align the foot plus or minus 10 degrees, then your polymer angle will be measured within about 2/3 of a degree, which I think is, pretty good. And by the way, aligning plus or minus 10 degrees is very easy to do visually. Even a 5-degree misalignment, you can see it visually. It's up to you. Do you want to pick up the hoof and try and make the horse stand better one more time before you shoot the rad? But so we get within 5 degrees alignment very easily, just eyeballing it. And the result is a good polymer angle. So that's that. Let's see. I'm not sure if I'm going to have time for everything in my presentation, but let me just point out, as I mentioned before, there is a way to find the center of articulation by fitting a circle through the articular surface. The center of that circle is the center of rotation of the coffin joint. And this, we did a study years ago and dissected cadavers and did a brute force biomechanical measurement. And we sort of proved that that assertion is true. What we proved is that the center of that circle, as found in a lateral radiograph, is within about 1 millimeter of the biomechanical rotation center. So anyway, you could look up this paper referenced at the bottom if you wanted. And then that is used in the automatic measuring system for various things. This is one circuit measurement we make. We drop that center of articulation down and measure how much of the foot is ahead of that compared to how much is behind that. There's some details about how you measure at the tip of the toe, how you take breakover into account. But anyway, and then if you apply that to hundreds of feet, here's a study we did, 882 front feet from 441 horses. And the average value we found is about 2/3 from the articulation center forward, about 2/3 of the foot. So just an example. And on the DP radiograph, I think I'm probably going to skip this or go very quickly through it because we're getting low on time and I want to show one more thing after this. The red line here is the approximate axis of rotation of the coffin joint, if you think about it a while. But how could we find that in a DP radiograph? So we're going to argue that the orientation of the coffin joint axis is the most interesting measure of medial lateral balance. This is an extreme case where if we measured the underside of the P3 bone, we have the blue line. But if we could find this red line, which represents the axis of rotation of the coffin joint, they're quite different here. And as a farrier, would you trim the hoof to make the red line parallel to ground or the blue line parallel to ground? Most horses don't have this much disparity. This is a special case to make the point. But that's what we're after. And we sort of think the red line is better because the underside of the P3 bone can be remodeled, can be strange for many reasons. And also it images differently if you have a higher block or lower block. We have a better way to estimate the red line. So that's what we propose as a way to measure things. In fact, you can think of many ways of trying to assign a line that help you with medial lateral balance. The purple line is like a T-square behind the horse. The red line is what a lot of people do. They draw something across the bottom of the bone. The blue line here is going through these two little openings in the bone called the nutrient foramina. And that has been suggested as a way to set a line through a bone and use that for medial lateral balance. We say that this green line, which is at the most distal points of the P2 condyles, if those two most distant points draw this green line, we argue that that's a good way to find the orientation of the axis of rotation of the coffin joint. And this yellow line up above is an experimentally found axis. So we actually did this. We actually had an experimental way on a cadaver leg to find the yellow line, and then we compared it to all these other methods, and the green line was the closest to that. So I'm going to skip here. Here's a cadaver leg. We put bolts into it. We did all this crazy stuff. I'm just flying through this because we're out of time. Here's the result. The red line is the experimentally located axis of rotation, which is about where it should be. And then the green line, the nutria foramina, and the bottom of the P3 bone. And the nutria foramina are pretty good, as it turns out, and some other things we've looked at. They're pretty good, but usually using the bottom of the condyles of P2 beat it slightly in terms of being closest axis of rotation. So take-home message: in a DP radiograph, a good estimation of the orientation of the joint axis can be obtained by drawing a line specified by the most distal points on the condyles. Not proven, our opinion at this point. So again, here's a strange case. And this horse we would shoe with the blue line approximately parallel to ground, and it would do well, even though there's a big mismatch down here if you're looking at the bone. And the same technique can be used at all three joints in the lower leg. In a lateral radiograph, we fit circles. In the center of the circles are a location of the axis. On the DP radiograph, we draw lines in the most distal condyles, and that is a good estimation of the orientation of the axes of rotation, just offset. They're offset by the radius of these circles, but they have the same orientation. And as the final thing I want to say, we're also doing deep learning for hoof photos. So we developed a system called the EponaCam system to help us take excellent hoof pictures, and I will show you a quick video on this.
Introducing EponaCam. Whether you're an owner, farrier, or veterinarian, tools to keep track of the horse's hoof are important. EponaCam is a smartphone app, along with a hardware cradle, that converts any smartphone into a hoof camera. EponaCam works with the Metron block to ensure that a perfect image of the hoof, suitable for later analysis, is captured. The app sends images by Wi-Fi directly to Metron software, which runs on a nearby PC or tablet. EponaCam uses deep learning to provide ease of use. The image is automatically recognized, labeled, calibrated, and measured. EponaCam enables the pursuit of evidence-based soundness and will help the care.
Okay, so that's the EponaCam, which we're now using to take hoof photographs. Full disclosure, the 4% error rate that I talked about in the radiographs, we're not as good as that with the photographs yet. Because the radiographs, we successfully trained the system on 240,000 images. The photographs, we only have photos taken with the EponaCam since we invented the EponaCam, which was last November. And so we've only trained on a few thousand images, but it's going to get better. We keep getting more data and retraining, and it gets better and better. As a final statement, I wanted to say that, although we're big proponents of measuring the hoof, we are not dogmatically enforcing certain values. Palmar angle, people like to argue anything between 1 degree and 6.5 degrees we consider normal. And in fact, 0 degrees is probably not so bad, and is probably what some feet need and what they're going to do. So we don't believe in forcing the trim to make feet match or to get a certain numerical value. In fact, usually when we're at the horse working, we're not paying attention to these numbers. But if you look at them later that evening and you look at long-term tracking, you figure out what sort of values a certain horse likes, it's really valuable. But I just want people to know we're not measurement Nazis. We're not enforcing certain numbers, even though we believe strongly that one should measure the foot. So by means of summary, these are the 4 images of the foot, 2 radiographs and 2 photographs that we now can automatically calibrate and measure. So a lot of the work is done for you, and I think it's going to help a lot of practitioners sort of get over the hump. All these things are done for you, and the numbers are presented to you, and it's pretty accurate if you've stood the horse properly. And that is the end of my talk. I went a little longer than I wanted, but maybe there's a bit of time for questions. And in any case, there's some things on this slide. You could visit our website to learn more. And we're going to be at the AAEP convention in a month or 2, and also then at the Hoof Summit in Cincinnati. So we hope you'd come by and talk to us at those places.
Great. Thank you very much, John. We do have a few questions, so I'll get right to them. Is there a college course on this anywhere in the United States?
Well, there's probably not really, but there's sort of one at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, because myself and my wife Monique go there and teach some lectures each year. So that's a course called Equine Biomechanics. It's taught to animal science majors, a lot of which are pre-vet students. But otherwise, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not aware if there are other things.
Question from Scottsdale, Arizona. What are the benefits of using the system in laminitic cases?
Well, I think in laminitic cases, in my experience, they're typically rotated and very high on the heel. And we try to, once you're past the acute phase, we try to lower the heel and get the palmar angle back into sort of a normal range. A lot of practitioners kind of do the opposite. They put wedge pads in, and that might be the right thing to do when it's acute, when there's still tearing of tissues going on. But once things have settled down, now you've got a horse with really way too high palmar angle. We try to get it back into the zone. And doing that, you have to be a little bit careful. You don't want to do it all at once, put too much stress on the tendons. And so a measurement system where you could track the palmar angle and try and reduce it a few degrees each, 6-week shoeing kind of thing would be, really helpful. So I think a laminitic case is just another case of more generally that measuring is good and helpful. But in that case, I'd really think about it as far as managing getting the heels back into a normal range.
If you have if you're in a situation in which a vet doesn't have any kind of scale marker, is there something practical such as a quarter that can be used as a marker?
Yeah, you can, if you have to, anything that is of known size that you will later be able to know the size of. And the trick is you need to, as I said, put it in the so-called plane of interest. So one thing we can do with a horse, like a lateral x-ray, is take a farrier's nail, take a shoeing nail, and tape it to the center line of the hoof, right in the center line pointing down at the toe. And that'll show up in the radiograph and be a scale marker. But you'll have to remember what size nail that was. Maybe measure it with a ruler and know that, oh, that's 2.25 inches. Then later in any software system, there should be a way to indicate that that thing was 2.25 inches, and that'll set a scale for the image. So yeah, you can on the fly kind of put your own scale marker in if you need to. We need to get more vets using proper scaling things. So it's part of, we're trying to be educational in our efforts and get vets doing this. And a lot are now, but still a ways to go.
Which radiograph systems have this program?
In the United States, there's a company called Vettel, V-E-T-E-L, and they are sort of like our distributor for the United States. So they sell a DR system based on Metron. But what we're announcing at AAEP, not that I'm doing a sales pitch here, but we're announcing at AAEP a new product called EponaMind. And EponaMind is a software product that can be added to any DR system. So any DR system from any popular manufacturer, because they all are so-called DICOM compliant, we can hook onto that. And EponaMind provides the artificial intelligence and all the automatic measuring and scaling stuff. So starting an AAP, that'll be a good choice for a lot of people that have some other system and just want to add this stuff to it.
How important is it that the block is level versus whatever the ground surface is? Many places don't have a concrete slab per se, so taking measurements from the actual ground surface is required. How close to level does a block need to be to get an accurate result in the measurements?
Yeah, it's terrible how farriers have to work sometimes. I really wish that horses could always be shod on a poured concrete floor with a 1/2-inch rubber mat on it. That's like perfect thing. But yeah, I've also been out in the field in the middle of a pasture occasionally. I don't really have an answer in terms of numbers for that. It's, the more level, the better is kind of the answer. I just, I want people to do it right and not be put in those situations. So I haven't spent a lot of time trying to quantify how bad it is out there. It's just bad, and you should get onto a level place if you at all can. I feel your pain.
Have you made the cursor smaller for marking the parameters in the system when measuring from hoof photos?
The cursor smaller. I'm not quite sure what they mean. Maybe they have our system, maybe an older version, and the cursor would sort of block what they were seeing. I guess that's what it sounds like. Okay. I don't think it's an issue now. Some of this can be related to the photo. The photo, a modern digital camera will make these photos, which are ginormous. They're 20 megapixels, which is actually much more than you need. At the other extreme, an older camera might make a photo that has too low a resolution, too few pixels. And if it has too few pixels, then it gets in the system, then everything looks kind of chunky and things are bigger on it than they should be. So certainly everyone is starting to go to these smartphones. That's why we made the EponaCam product. And if you use that sort of system, that's the one we're now focused on for our work. And I think the photos from a smartphone like that, I don't think there's issues that I'm aware of.
Have you tried it on mules or draft horses or other types of breeds?
Yeah, we've definitely all breeds. We haven't, we don't really have any mules in our database. Their feet are different, boxier and narrower. We have some drafts, and we've used it on drafts, and we use it on Friesians and Percherons, sort of halfway between warm bloods and drafts. So yeah, we use it in all those things. It's all pretty much the same. Our hoof block, you put a draft foot on it, the foot actually hangs over the sides of the block a little bit, but that's okay. You can still use the same block. You don't need to have a bigger block. You still try and get the center line of the hoof on the center line of the block. So all the same stuff happens.
And running low on time, so we have one more question. What's the price point for Farriers for the software and phone camera device? And generally, do you have an idea what Farriers are charging?
Well, if you go to EponaMind.com, you can look at all the pricing and stuff. There's something called the bundle, which is the full shebang. You get all the blocks, all the hardware stuff, the EponaCam, you get the software, and it's $1,500 for the whole bundle. Now that's the Farrier version called Metron Hoof, and it doesn't have the artificial intelligence for radiographs, because that has to really be associated with the DR system. But for the photo stuff, it does have the AI stuff, and it's got the EponaCam and all that good stuff. And it's compatible with radiographs. You can get radiographs sent to you from your vet, so you can pull them in, but it's a little bit limited. Then there's a veterinary product you could go to if you were a vet, and either you should get EponaMind, the new product we're announcing at AAP, or you should buy a DR system that comes with Metron as its software. What Farriers charge, I think it's kind of all over the map. I want Farriers to offer their clients a service like, besides sharing your horse, I'm going to give you a report showing you these measurements of their hoof, and I'm going to show you how it's changed over 3 months or 6 months. And you need to charge for that. And it's a way to start making some money sitting at a computer in the evening instead of bending over a horse. So I'm all for that. And I know of some guys that have done it, and it ranges from, I don't know, I know one guy, he just charged like $50. He'd do that every second shoeing. And that would be kind of a report. You know, horse owners worry about their horse's feet. And if you offer to give them something that kind of, something they can hold on to and look at, they'll pay for it, I think. So I hope you can do that.
Great, thank you very much. All right, that's all the time we have today. Today's presentation audio will be made available on the American Farriers Journal website in the event you'd like to go back and review it. Watch your email and the AFJ newsletter for more information. We'll send that out within 24 hours. On behalf of John Craig, EponaMind, and American Farriers Journal, thank you very much for joining us for tonight's webinar. When you leave the webinar, you'll be directed to a short survey. Please feel free to reach out to us and let us know what you thought of the live event, and if there are any topics you'd like for us to cover in future webinars. Thank you again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your night.